But hello, everyone. So this is Vicky there in the corner for the keynote, the end note, actually, I think, for today. Carl Perry's just rushed off in the background there, but I just wanted to give a little bit of this isn't like a deliberate surprise ambush here, but I know there's a couple of people on here who've been greatly influenced by you, Vicky, and so we're just going to give you a little bit of a hello. This is totally unplanned. So Kamea, when we chatted in Nelson, here where I live, and it turned out that we had a mutual admiration society going on for Vicky Mabin, because Vicky was, you were her student many, not that many years ago, making you all sound old, and you did some work with the Police Museum, I think it was.
Yes, yeah, I did. I was part of a cohort of museum managers and directors that did a strategic leadership course through National Services Te Pairangi. And yeah, Vicky was just, she was just a part of that, but transformed my relationship to transformation. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, you were when we chatted, you were busy telling me about that and how you were still using current reality trees and clouds out there in the wild. So I think that's a nice legacy to have. Now, Graham Scott, what happened to you?
Well, I had a rush of blood to the head. I'd been using ToC with clients at work and teaching it, had a rush of blood to the head and decided that I needed to do a degree, a master's degree of some sort. So I knew Vicky's the local Australasian expert in ToC, certainly in the academic world. So emailed her and she was good enough to take me on as a student. Yeah. And so I'm an accountant by training, so I looked at budgeting in large organisations through a ToC lens, and it was wonderful having the academic rigour there, having to do all the research and just be challenged on all the way through. So a fantastic experience, and I think it's raised my understanding of ToC another couple of levels.
Yeah.
So thank you, Vicky.
Well done. Yeah.
Now, Carl, we of course didn't know each other until a few years ago. And then we met in Wellington Airport one time, and you started going on and on and on and on and on about a paper that Vicky had written. Have you two met in person before?
Once
at a ToC conference, and I think it might have been Vegas. So it was a few years ago. Yeah. But
tell everyone.
Yeah. So I had a bit of an epiphany in 2005 about applying the thinking processes to the human system, and I went away from that and was looking for all sorts of stuff, and I found there was very little about it, but I found a number of Vicky's papers. One of them was around personal productivity, which was really great. I think that was in a bank kind of environment. If not, that's another paper. But there's 2 or 3 papers which had a thread of psychology in them, and I could see the connections. And of course, one I mentioned in Mariana's session, which is harnessing resistance to change. And so there's I've actually, Vicky, your work has been quite inspiring and quite empowering for me, because I kind of looked and went, wow, okay, now I can see how this can work, and it's kind of informed a lot of the work going forward. So that's kind of my my praise, actually, Vicky. I really appreciate it. It's been very, very valuable for me.
Now, I know there's one other person on the call. I'm not going to ask you to speak, Emily, but I think you might have had a slightly more influence there. Emily was the subject of one of the stories that you use in your teaching when you teach clouds, Vicky. So it's actually nice to see. I can't actually see, I can see Emily's picture there, but she's in the background. And she's just missed out on hearing all these glowing, wonderful things about her mum. So that awkwardness is out the way. Now, I think I can top all of you because I blame Vicky for me being right here now talking to all you guys. 1997, I think it was, I read some computer magazine because I'm a geek, and at the back of it, they'd run out of space clearly about, they had book reviews. And this person says, by the way, I just read this book that I happened to read, and it's nothing to do with computers, but I thought you'd really enjoy it. It's a novel that's set in a factory, and you'll just learn all sorts of stuff. You'll be amazed by it. And I just thought, that just sounds too weird to be true. So I got on the internet, or the yellow pages in the telephone book, and I rang around all of the Wellington bookshops to see if there was this weird book called The Goal. And it turned out that there was, and it was in the university bookshop in Wellington. So I jumped in my car and drove in, and I got the copy of this book. And I became absolutely hooked, of course, once I read it, like a lot of people. And it turns out that the reason that book was in that shop is because Vicky was teaching it at Victoria University. So if it wasn't for that chance coincidence, I don't reckon I'd be here anyway. But anyway, there you go. Didn't mean to make you awkward. It was just while we had it, I just looked at the screens. I just saw, hey, look, that's pretty cool. And for those who think we might just be making this stuff up, in the background of Vicky's picture there, you can actually see the ToC ICO Lifetime Achievement Award that Vicky was given, I think, earlier this year, last year. So I think it's pretty cool. We're in the presence of greatness, and I'll stop going on and on and on and on about now. Don't want to embarrass you anymore, Vicky, but thank you for all of us. And now that we've set this bar so high, deliver.
It's only down from here, right? Yeah.
It's only down from there. But anyway, it's all yours, Vicky. Thank you.
Now, have you got my screen there?
We have indeed.
Okay, right, fine. Okie dokie. Well, thank you very much, Clark and everyone, for all of those very lovely things. I'm just trying to get back to a slightly more sensible view. Right, okay. No, it's just playing silly things. Okay, so thank you for inviting me. And what I'm going to talk about is flipping the frame, which was Clark's sort of interpretation of what we've been talking about at various stages, because as you've gathered, I've done, used ToC quite a lot for the last, an embarrassingly long time. I think I came across The Goal in 1986. But I've also been using it with other models as well. So I've used ToC a lot. And I have been mixing and matching it with other models. And it's only when you have the benefit of retiring that you sort of look back and you can see a pattern sort of through what you've done. And I realized that actually I was doing this sort of mix and matching way back. And actually, I expect that most of you are doing mix and matching too. So what I'm hoping to do is just bring it up a little level. And Clark, some of the other speakers today already have talked about combining with other methods as well, which is great. So like Carl introduced quite a few other models and people that he's been influenced by. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about mixing and matching and give you some examples of where we've done it, and hopefully it might inspire you to do something similar. So what do we mean by a frame? Well, when you buy a house, you're going to look for a house. You see the beautiful brochures and the real estate agent thingy, and you think, oh, yeah, that looks pretty nice. And then you go and have a look at it in reality, and it looks slightly different. And then you look at the plans, and you get another view of it. And then you get what we call the LIM report, the Land Information Report, and that tells you another story about the history. Now, each of those views of this one property are a frame, if you like. They're a different way of looking at that property. And before you buy your house, you better jolly well look at all of those frames, because otherwise you might buy something that is not what you expect it to be. So a frame is just a cognitive window through which we view the world. That's sort of one of the sort of formal definitions of a frame. But it's just a way of seeing things. It's a perspective. But when we're using models, like the theory of constraints, thinking process models, or the 5 focusing steps, they're each a view on a problem, and they each provide us with a way of seeing the situation or the problem. And so each one of those is a model, is a frame. So why frame and why reframe? I think using different frames help us to get a better perspective of a problem. So hopefully that answers why we need to reframe as well as just frame up a problem. So how it all really began, I was explaining this to Clark the other day and decided to actually use this as this first example that I'll give you, because back in the late 90s, I was teaching and I was doing some consulting with our consulting wing, VicLink, and we've been asked to do some work, and we've been asked to actually do a request for proposal, put in a bid to do a project. And it was fairly standard for the sorts of things I'd been doing already, but it actually posed a few issues, because there was one person who I'll call Dick Birdenhand, who was very keen for us to take the project because it would give some dollars and much needed income, and it would, you see, the business go up. But on the other hand, there was another person in the team, I'll call her Sarah Toogood, who thought that the project wasn't a very nice one. It would actually disaffect a large or some proportion of the population, and she thought it was going to be negative for us, that it would give us a negative, bad reputation over time. And then here's me as one of the consultants being brought in, one of the analysts being brought in, thinking about how the heck do we, what should we do here? And so I was sort of trying to piece together the bits of the puzzle and trying to work out what was the best approach. So here's this request for proposal, and should we bid? And there was this definite clash of views. And one of the models that I'd been using was from Rousseau and Shoemaker, who these two guys over here who are consultants out of the States. And they'd written some really good books. One of them's called Decision Traps. One's called Winning Decisions or Confident Decision Making. There's a series of them. And they do what's called a frame analysis. And so they define the frame as, there's usually a metaphor or a motto, like a bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush. So that's why I called him Dick Birdenhand. He was looking at the short-term profits, and sort of break even would be good enough for him. So formally, we talk about the boundaries we put around the problem. What's the yardstick we use to measure success? And what's the critical point on that yardstick, below which is failure, above which is success? And maybe break even, or small percentage could be the profit. Could be what was his break-even point, was his reference point. On the other hand, Sarah Toogood was looking at quite a different framing. She had framed the problem quite differently. She was much more broad in her thinking, more community or long-term thinking rather than this short-term business focus. She was thinking about the social outcomes for the poor and perhaps the reputation for the company. Her reference point, if you think about social outcomes for the poor, then the reference point was probably the current well-being of those people, and the reputation, the reference point against we're measuring success and failure would be, say, the current reputation. So that's a really quick synopsis of how we do a frame analysis, but you can see what's coming out of that. There's really this sort of clash of opinions. No one's right. It's just showing you how, it's highlighting how the different choices are due to the different ways that people have set up the boundaries, the yardsticks, and the reference points.
Can I just interrupt there? Say that's just blown my mind. The motto, you know, the two mottos there. We've all heard those sayings, but but just seeing it there and contrasting the two worldviews, that just jumps out. It's just wow. Anyway,
Yeah,
I'll stop being excited now. That's really cool.
I've called a motto, but it could also be a metaphor. And
yes, yeah.
a metaphor is a really, really quick way of capturing a big picture. It's a really good way of communicating with a group that you're needing to bring on. You'll often hear people talking about a marathon or a, you know, well, there's no point deciding on what mode of transport we use until we know what journey we're going on, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So we use metaphors very, very effectively to convey things very quickly and powerfully.
Yeah,
and get
that's really
rally.
lovely. Cool.
So this way of framing things is it doesn't help us with how to resolve the problem. Now, who's thinking, yeah, well, why don't we use an evaporating cloud? Because we know in ToC there's a really good way of resolving conflict. So let's look at it in terms of the conflict. Ellie Goldratt, theory of constraints. It's not luck, was where it first sort of hit the world. Oh, perhaps slightly earlier than that, 1990. And so we frame it as two sides and we use various boxes. And so basically the conflict is, should we bid or not bid for this job? And on the one hand, Dick thinks that we should bid because we need to increase our revenue. On the other hand, Sarah says, no, we shouldn't bid because we need to protect our reputation or look after the poor, whichever. And what do the two have in common? We need a profitable business long term. In order to do that, we must increase our revenue in the short term. In order to do that, we must bid for this job. On the other hand, in order to have a profitable business, we must protect our reputation. If you like, that's the long-term business. And in order to do that, we must not bid for this job. So a simple way of depicting the problem. Now, the nice thing about the cloud, and you'll notice for those of you who are new to clouds, I've constructed it right to left because it's generated by a conflict that we're seeing rather than starting at the goal on the left-hand end. So you can go both ways. We construct the clouds differently for different types of situations, but whatever works in the situation is fine. Does that make sense as a cloud? Makes sense. So the cloud shows it as a two-way conflict. And instead of saying that it has to keep existing that way, we assume that we can actually resolve it by challenging those assumptions. And so now how are we going to go about doing that? We're looking for breakthrough ideas to get essentially B and C without having to argue over D and D prime. Now, with this sort of cloud, not going as deep as the mindset clouds that Carl looked at, with this sort of cloud, I think you can solve it between B and D, C and D prime, or even between the other two. Now, the construct of the cloud is such that D jeopardizes C. If we bid for the job, Sarah believes we're going to jeopardize protecting our reputation. And on the other hand, if we don't bid for the job, Dick is concerned that we're not going to increase our revenue, we're not going to survive. So we want to challenge those assumptions. You can also challenge it in here at between D and D prime, and there's some really neat tools for doing that, but I won't sort of focus on that today. I'll just keep with the other ones. So we ask, one of the quick ways of asking, rather than surfacing all your assumptions, a quick way of doing it is just to cover up box D prime and say, how can we bid for this job and still protect our reputation? And you'll come up with ideas. Well, perhaps if we do it really well, you can think of ideas and put them in the chat if you like. How could you do those as well? You could, have we got any suggestions coming up? Not yet. So how could you bid for this job and protect our reputation? Well, if we did it really well, if we did the consultation with the affected people really well, if we did a really solid piece of analysis, perhaps we would protect our reputation. Or perhaps we can put in some conditions or clauses in the tender contract that protect us, or have a really good PR machine. Yeah, okay, charge them a fortune, hire a PR team. Yep. Okay, so on the other hand, we could ask the other way around as well, and we could ask, how could we, okay, so you can see that the cloud is helping us to come up with lots of ideas by asking these directed questions. We'll cover up the other box and ask, how can we not bid for the job and still increase our revenue? How can we do that? We don't have to bid. If we didn't bid for this job, how could we increase our reputation? We could get our, bid for different jobs, find a better job, get a reputation for increasing revenues. We could do all sorts of other things. Offer a better service. So the cloud has been able to provide us with lots of new breakthrough ideas to get B and C without arguing over DD prime. What it shadows, though, is the uncertainties that surround the sequence of events and how it all might unfold over time. And so as I was thinking about this, I was thinking, because first of all, I thought, oh, it's, it's the Dick versus Sarah. And then I thought, oh, it's a cloud. And then I thought, oh, actually, I need to use something that's going to help me think through the ongoing sort of the way things will unfold, because it was all very uncertain. So I decided to use what we call a decision tree frame. Now, this is from Standard Operations Research Decision Analysis. You can Google decision tree. Wikipedia gives you a nice little sort of summary. And in this frame, what we're doing is we start off with a decision in a square box, and we can either bid or not bid. If we bid, then we might win the bid or we might not. If we win it and we do a good job, then we'll be happy. If we win the bid but do a poor job, well, there are a couple of options here. We might have a public outcry, which will be a very bad situation, or we could have no outcry. But we did a poor job, we're not very happy, so it's sort of a glum face. And if we don't win, then we could do other jobs and get a smiley face, or we could get no other jobs and go down the gurgler. And if we don't bid, we could either get other jobs or no jobs. So this is a really simple representation. I didn't have any data, any numbers to put on it, no probabilities, but you could see there were some outcomes that we wanted to avoid if we could. So there was some, if we could get some other jobs, that would be fine instead. Or if we could manage the outcry, not so good. But there's certainly some things that we wanted to avoid. Doing a bad job and getting a public outcry wouldn't do us any good. Okay, so the decision tree frame, what does that help us with? It highlights the sequence of actions and chance outcomes that can occur that are kind of out of our control, or are they? The insights are that we need to reduce or manage those risks from the negative outcomes that we don't want. And it shadows the practicality of managing those risks and possible feedback loops and things like that. So it also shadows the fact that we can actually get in there and do things. So I think that's what we need to think about next. And so you're thinking, okay, well, what other frames could we use that would get to that sort of issue? And one that we could use is a causal loop diagram frame. Peter Senge made these popular in his book, The Fifth Discipline, in the 1990s. And it's based on system dynamics modeling, which is way back in the mid 1900s, I think. I should have a date on that, but Forrester was one of the people first. And in this sort of modeling, what we're doing is we're sort of following cause effect loops. So if we the more the number of projects, so you're looking at the things that can happen if we get the project. The more projects that we get, the bigger the staff workload. There won't be time available to do a good job. Our reputation will go down, and the number of bids that we win is going to go down. And so you get reinforcing or balancing loops. I'm not going to go through them all, but it's the more I'll go through this one. That's a reinforcing one. The number of projects goes up, more profits we get more resources, we can put more bids in, we get more wins, and we can increase the number of projects. So again, sorry, I keep hitting the wrong thing. Again, we're, this is a reinforcing loop, getting better and better. Some of them are balancing loops, which sort of holds it at play. And the causal loop diagrams are really good at sort of mapping out the things that can get better and better, the things that will balance, and it gets better and then it stops getting better and gets worse again and balances out and so on. What it does is sort of takes us out into a slightly bigger picture and the dynamics of the situation, and helps us look at the balancing and reinforcing things. But it shadows the quantitative aspects or interventions. So yes, Kumu is absolutely amazing, isn't it? This allows us to sort of, it gives you another sort of idea about how it all fits together. Anyway, so the question comes, well, which is the correct frame to use? Ruth, aren't you want to make a talk about a frame of best fit, looking for a frame of best fit? And you think, well, what is it? Because each of these frames pulls out different things, different aspects, and they're all very helpful. It so happened that I was teaching an honours class about this stage, and I wrote this little dilemma up for my class to tackle as a little case study to look at. And used it for the last class, and we just spent the whole class session of 3 hours or something picking one of these frames, one of the models that I'd taught them, because I taught them something like 12 models over the course of the thing, including ToC models. And we just went through each one of them and sort of worked at a whiteboard and just said, well, if we chose this frame, what would that tell us about this problem? And under this frame, what would it tell us about this problem? We just filled the board with whiteboards. You can just think of like a glorified back of envelope exercises, really. And so we did there were a few more that we could add in, like the negative branch and multi-criteria. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. And under each of these frames, they all raise different questions. You do different analysis and you come up with different ideas. It's worth pointing out that each of these models is actually a frame, and when you start off, it's empty and you have to fill it. The evaporating cloud is a 5-box structure. You start off, you have to fill that frame, and having that way of filling a frame is actually very helpful. The model prompts us, it nudges us to fill the frame, which is very helpful because it helps you not forget things. It helps you visit all the bits and think things properly through. So you can see this was thinking slow in Kahneman and Tversky's sessions. But what I came up with at the end was I put them all together in this crazy diagram. There's basically a whole lot of envelopes squashed together into a wheel diagram. And at the bottom in the center are all of these sorts of strategies that came out of these different models. So they're generic strategies. Some of them were suggested before. We could extend the time boundary so that we could get better consulting. Don't just take the jobs that come. We could actually go out and look at proper jobs. Prioritize the jobs based on dollar return versus risk. That's using the constraint management sort of formula. We could manage the risk and get better public relations and use project management. We could get everyone on side, focus resources, make it a success. We could be proactive and challenge the assumptions. So, you know, those are some of the ideas that come out of several of these different ideas. A very sanitized version was put together for writing this up in journal articles and so on. I've given you the references there if you want to go and have a bit more. So the lessons you get out of this is that no single frame can capture all aspects of the problem. So there's no point looking for the frame of best fit. Instead, frame, reframe, multi-frame, because a variety of frames will give you useful insights. Now, you might be terrified and think, well, God, if I have to do this for every jolly problem I encounter, what's that going to do? But actually, it can be quite simple. Just flipping a frame once is really helpful. So the next example I'll talk about is a strategic priority setting one, where we did another consulting project, same VicLink organization. And we were working for a new coalition of several social service agencies who'd never worked with each other before. So they needed to collaborate to decide priorities for which projects out of their wish list of 16 possible projects they would put forward. And there were just as many criteria they came up with. And we decided to use a multi-criteria method. This was written up and I've got permission to share it from the group. So we started off with a multi-criteria model, and inspired by Carl this morning, who actually shows pictures of the people who've influenced them. I show a picture of Val Belton, who's a professor at Strathclyde in Scotland, who created the visa decision-making method. And basically what you're doing is you've got all your alternatives down here for the different possibilities that we could use. The different criteria are put into a hierarchical tree, and then you score the projects against those criteria and you weight the criteria, and it automatically comes up with a sort of, well, you can pull up this XY plot. Now, because it's talking costs versus benefits, we actually want to be in this top left-hand corner where we've got the best benefits for the least costs. You've still got a sort of a clutch of projects down here, but we can sort of work through those and work out which ones are the best ones to put in place. Now, we spent a day constructing this model, and then I said to them, so what do you actually have to do to make this all happen? So I flipped the frame, and we went into, the next day we went into a prerequisite tree frame. And in this one, we're asking, well, what do we need to do? What needs to be in place to make sure that those chosen projects, whichever one we decide, would be successful? It's a very different question from the one we just asked, which was prioritizing from a given list of projects. It's a completely different question. So what we first do, and this is a copy of the old whiteboard with all of the rubbings out and the, you know, addings and taking out. First of all, we took some time to work out what the target was for the prerequisite tree. Now, those of you who haven't seen a prerequisite tree, it's one of the Gold-Rat theory of constraints thinking process tools, which helps you in the implementation phase. And the first step is to identify the target. And then you ask everybody, well, what's going to stop you from reaching that? Now, everybody's very good at listing out all the reasons why they can't possibly achieve it. And so I just wrote them all down as they said them. I just wrote all these obstacles down, and you go around the room and just get everybody a turn to list an obstacle until you've dried up. And then, you know, people would, because of the PRT tool, you're not scared about people coming up with all the bad things. You actually then say, okay, so what do we need to do to get over these? What they're officially called the intermediate objectives. What are the necessary steps? What are the things we're going to do to get over the obstacles? And you just go through them one at a time. So we don't have enough resources. How are we going to get over that? Well, we have to employ somebody to make it happen. What about all the general myths about alcohol and drugs services? well, we need to da 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 da. So people were coming up with the ideas for what they could do to get over each one. And so we just worked through them as a list. And then we got lots of sticky notes and bits of butcher paper, a great big flip chart paper, put them on the ground, and we just started working out where things would go. And this is my version written out of what all the things we had to do, written out in a tree sort of diagram, but they were done using sticky notes onto pieces of paper. And doing it on the floor or on a table, actually, apparently when you lean over and do things like physically like this, it engages a different part. It engages the feeling part. And so it's quite a powerful way of getting people to engage and do things. So that was the PRT. What it helped us to do, the MCDA model had helped us choose the best from the given set of alternatives according to those criteria that we'd agreed upon. But then the question sort of was nagging, will they deliver what they want? But then when we asked the PRT, they figured out what would be stopping them from reaching the target and what practical steps were needed. And actually what was at the bottom of that tree were things like, we need to actually get somebody to act as the focal point. We need to actually work out what's missing in the space before we can work out what we need to do and therefore ask for money and bids and whatever and set up our projects. And the group were very clear that if they hadn't done this, they would have just sort of left the room and nothing really they wouldn't really have achieved their goals. And so this prerequisitory was really, really helpful for them to get where they wanted to go. So that's a couple of examples. Are we up for some more? And without the PRT, the benefits would have been much harder to achieve. I've got a couple of other ones that I can share with you. The Gould's Fine Foods, I have actually shared a few times. It's been one of the classic ones. I came across this, and I think it was about 1994 or 95. I started teaching on the MBA program at Vic, and I was teaching a problem-solving decision-making course. And I said at the start of the class, "Oh well, this is what we're doing. If you have any problems you want to tackle, let me know." And this chap up the back thumped the table and said, "We've got plenty you can have." And it was John Gibson, who was plant manager at this local small goods company, Gould's Fine Foods. And so later on, when we came to a particular module, I talked to him about the sorts of problems they had, and he and I collaborated on getting some data out of his factory. And yes, they had a situation where they were sharing 2 product lines. I taught them the P's and Q's and linear programming, and wanted a case that would be similar to that for them to tackle as a class assessment. And so, yes, they had a case where they were making sausages and hams. The demands are very variable, and as you know, today it's pouring with rain. It wouldn't be a good day for a barbecue, but when it's a lovely day, the demand for sausages goes up. They had shared production resources for processing these 2 types of products. They couldn't meet demand. There was lots of unplanned overtime. And so the question I posed to the class was, well, what's your advice to the plant manager, John Gibson? Should they purchase more equipment? A typical business case type thing. I'd said that there was another plant that was closing down. There was some spare equipment. Should they go buy it? So, you pose them a little situation for them to think about. So I said, go off and use linear programming. And by the way, if you can use the 5 focusing steps, go for it. So I'll just walk you through the sort of analytical process. Nothing unusual about doing a process flow chart. In this case, the ham ingredients, this is for sort of those square hams that they use for chopping up and putting into pies and sandwiches and so on, pressed ham. Hams and sausages were mixed. The ingredients were obviously mixed separately, but then they shared the filling process and the cooking, the chilling, pack and dispatch. They had some information in the case that they could massage to get this data. It wasn't nearly as presented. It was sort of all in a narrative. They had to pick it out and fill in some gaps. And then they were supposed to put it into a spreadsheet, a linear programming model to use for a spreadsheet, which they could do quite easily. You set it up and then you press the button and it goes, and it tells you the answer. But if we just look at it, what you can see is here's the critical bit of we've got actual resources that we need versus the resources we've got available in hours per week. So the first few processes are fine. This one here, filling, is we need more than twice what we've got. That's a big problem. The next one's fine. The next one's fine. The next one's close, but fine. Probably will be a, you know, scheduling type constraint and so on. So filling was the constraint. Now we can plot it on a graph and show the feasible region down here and so on. I won't sort of bore you with the details, but if you're into that sort of thing. So we can figure it out graphically, which shows us differently. We can use the 5 focusing steps where we focus on deciding the system and its goal. In this case, it's making profits. That's easy. Measuring progress towards the goal. How much profit are we making each week? And we can identify the constraints. In this case, it was filling capacity and also the sausage demand. We can exploit the constraint, subordinate, and so on. We can also use the ToC product mix heuristic, which is a quick way. If you've done the P's and Q's that Goldratt and Fox presented and used in their books and whatever, we're looking at how we can choose between 2 products like hams and sausages. And so you look at the net profit and you think, yeah, well, hams makes far more than sausages, so we should just make hams, right? Well, not so fast. What's the time that they need on the constraint? Hams needs 8 hours, sausages needs 1 hour. You do the maths, what do we get? Actually, if you look at the constraint, sorry, the profit per constraint hour, we only make 3/4 of a unit of profit per hour on the constraint if we're making hams, but we make 1 unit if we're making sausages. So actually it's more sensible to make sausages rather than hams. So this is a big sort of change in thinking. So I was teaching the students the P's and Q's as well, and so they could do that sort of thing. So what this did was what actually John Gibson had done the P's and Q's, the P's and Q's, the linear programming and 5 focusing steps all come up with similar ideas, but the 5 focusing steps really stopped them in their tracks. And even though John Gibson knew what his constraint was intimately, but actually this meant that he then went out back into the production line and looked at the process and thought, we're actually doing totally the wrong things here. And so they made some simple changes. They actually managed to improve the productivity, the profitability. They almost got rid of their overtime and so on. You can read the full story in one of those papers. So just focus on these frames, because the flow chart, sort of you get the idea of the sequence of operations. With the table, you've got a static display. With the spreadsheet, you're able to quickly call up the app, the optimization algorithm in the LP solver and get you optimal product mix very easily. The graph, I think that emphasizes the linearity that we're assuming. That's a big assumption. Is it good enough? Well, probably. In the zone, the 5 focusing steps helps us to exploit and subordinate before we elevate. And the product mix rule tells us the best product to get out of it, given our resource constraint. So they're very different frames. They complement each other really well. I think I've got a picture shortly. What I found when I started writing this up, because I thought, oh, this is interesting, I'll write it up as a case. And I found more and more that while the linear programming is very quick and easy and gives you an optimal solution, it actually is kind of very reactive and treats the constraints as given, whereas the ToC really gets you engaging your intuition and gets proactive questioning of the constraints. Have I got time to just do a quick whiz through a last one? I can't see Clark on my thing. Is it, what do you reckon?
Plenty of time.
Okay.
Apart from the fact that if it makes me hungrier.
No, I finished on sausages and hams.
All right, you shouldn't have said the word sausage and hams, but that's all right. I understand. Go for it.
So the last one I'll talk about is sustainable water management, which one of my wonderful students, Robin Moore, was doing for her master's thesis over 10 years ago now. And she looked at our local district, the Kapiti Coast, which is a fairly dry coastal area just north of Wellington. And basically they were going to run out of water. They were going to be in breach of their consent limits, or they'd be breaching the consent or running parts of the supply system out of water. And neither of those were acceptable options. So they were in a hard place. And so she used ToC, but with other things as well. So I want to just share some of those with you. The first thing she looked at was just to think about who's important in this. With ToC, we go and interview people and we go and talk to people, but the stakeholder analysis and stakeholder mapping is really helpful for thinking about who should we be talking to, what are the people that are, coming into, who should we be thinking about as we consider this system. And so the stakeholder mapping was a really important one for her to get her head around all the different entities involved. She used what we now call a goal tree. In those days, we called it the intermediate objectives map. Detmer, in his books, spent a whole chapter on this one. You're mapping the destination. You're trying to work out what it is that we're trying to reach and what are the critical success factors or criteria that we need to meet to get there. And then what are the necessary conditions? So you're building a necessary condition map, working downwards. So here's your goal, here are your critical success factors, and here are your necessary conditions. Now she started off with, we built one between us, sort of just thinking about it before she went out, and then she sort of shared it with her participants as she went to her interviews, and they adapted it and added to it and modified it. So she had several iterations of her intermediate objectives map as she went through the process, but it was a really useful tool to use. So here you're starting off with the big picture. What are we actually trying to achieve? It's a really positive thing to start off with. Often I think when we think about ToC, we think about this next tool, the current reality tree, which is asking what's wrong with the situation. And you're trying to work out what's the cause of all our woes. And you start off at the bottom top and you dig down, asking what's the problem, what's causing all these things. And it can be slightly sort of confronting and negative, whereas the goal tree, you're starting off with your ideals and people buy into that pretty well. The CRT provides you with clarity about what are the real key things that you need to do to fix to make the problem go away. So you need to fix these things down here. The evaporating cloud, again, she used several times because people were, she was in meetings with people when they were discussing about storage, and they had this big problem about, in order to ensure a secure water supply, they had to have sufficient water to meet demand. And in order to that, they had to build a storage facility soon. On the other hand, in order to ensure their secure water supply, they had to live within their means because they were the public entity, you know, the Kapiti District Council, funded by ratepayers. And in order to do that, they had to defer storage for at least 10 years. They couldn't do that. They couldn't fund the storage. So they went around in circles a bit, but you know, Robin helped them sort of by clarifying this and putting it as a cloud. And, you know, you get a bit of clarity there. And the discussions were around about how can you then use those guided questions to challenge it and find solutions. So we ask, how could we invest in more storage capacity and still live within our means? And they came up with various ideas like adding tanks, and I mean, they could put up rates, they could get various other people coming up with, you know, local funding and doing all sorts of other things. But what happens then is you actually end up, if you just invest in more storage capacity, what you end up quite often with is this, again, a causal loop diagram. What happens if you invest in water capacity, the water availability goes up, it stops the insecurity of water supply. In the short term, we have a balancing loop, makes the problem go away. But in the longer term, productivity and growth happens, demand for water goes up, and we get back to having our insecure water supply. So it's what we call a fix that fails. It's a short-term fix that has problems in the long term. And so you can discuss things like, well, what else do you need? We need to put in an injection or corrective action in place to actually start managing. If we put in some demand management systems and conservation, water conservation initiatives, then perhaps you could stop this this reinforcing loop happening around the outside and have a fix that fires rather than a fix that fails. So the causal loop diagram, you know, helps us look at the dynamics of the situation and the longer term. Okay, so if we did that action, what would happen? Now, we could have done negative branches as well, but the causal loop really taps into system patterns that we see over and over again in systems. There's a whole bunch of what we call archetypes, and the fix that fails is just one of those. So if they're there and they really work and they resonate, they capture the situation quickly and effectively, they're very useful to use. And you can ask the other way around, and she came up with a very novel solution that they then instituted. And then the prerequisite tree was the last one that she went through, which is mapping the how to get there. So she came up with used a whole lot of different frames, the stakeholder analysis, goal tree, current reality tree, evaporating cloud, the causal loop diagram, and the prereq tree. They all had different sorts of focuses. They came up with different insights. So just summing up, framing and reframing and multi-framing, each of those frames and all of those different examples acts as a window through which we view the problem, the world, that bit of the problem. And you want to look at different windows and look at through different things. They each have highlights, focus on something, but at the same time, you know, as Goldratt says, you can't focus on everything and focus on, if you're focusing on everything, you're focusing on nothing. Each of our frames forces us to focus on something, but in doing so, it shadows the things that are outside the frame. We kind of forget them for the moment. So by using complementary frames, we can compensate for those shadows. Each frame the frame choice is going to be influenced by your background and whatever you are used to doing, feel free to use. But it's very easy to become frame blind and not be aware that we're using those frames. And our experience is that no single frame is best, hence the idea about frame, reframe, multi-frame. Now, I've used ToC and I've illustrated some of these things with a whole bunch of different operations research and systems thinking methods. And I even got onto the metaphors, mottos stuff as well today. But you can use almost anything. Each method focuses on a different thing, it has a different focus, and the frame, the decision model that you're using forces you to ask different questions. You go and collect different data, you do different analysis. And so obviously you come up with different insights, and that's your different frame. But if you can use different frames to complement each other, then you can address the other's weaknesses and you can provide complementary perspectives. They might back each other up, they might contradict each other, and then you have to figure out how that works. You get a range of insights, and I think you come up with more robust decision-making and advice, especially in these sorts of ill-defined and strange situations. So my recommendations is that you use any of these models. They're just thinking aids. They're not a true representation of reality. They're just a representation, a partial representation. And the results of a model are not the answer, so they shouldn't be treated as such. They should actually help you to prompt further thinking. George Box had this saying, all models are wrong, some are useful, which resonates with people. And to me, I find that some models are very useful, especially the theory of constraints ones. They're some of my favorite, and they're my go-to. And the ToC models and frameworks complement other methods very successfully, I think. Now, I think in themselves, the set of tools that you've got in the thinking processes and the 5 focusing steps and drum, buffer, rope, whatever you want to define it, but I have that bigger set of, in my methodology, definition of what ToC is. And you've got a very broad and versatile set of methods. They give you critical thinking and communication. They're at the forefront. And I think they focus attention on the key aspects to help shine on the blind spots. Lastly, how should you choose frames? Well, I think you start off with what you know. So most people haven't started off being born into ToC, so you probably come up with other things. You'll have friends and colleagues who have different ways of thinking. Work with them. Think of other ways of combining. I think any frame will give you something useful. So don't worry about, this is the right frame. Just try anything. Experiment, try a number of frames, and do little back of envelope sketches. And what I find, even though they're back of envelope, they actually help you to expand your thinking. And you're looking for differences and similarities and also surprises. Ellie Schragenheim, well-known ToC thinker, says that surprises are the true trigger of learning, not mistakes. And last of all, have fun. Because I think, we all know that if you're in this sort of a playful mode, you actually have more creative ideas. Here's how to get in touch with me. Thank you very much. And I look forward, if there's hopefully a little bit of time for questions, because we did start a wee bit late, hopefully.
We started quite late. So that's not, if there's any questions there, that was my fault. That was beautiful, Vicky. I can't help but remember the time when I first went and got glasses. And suddenly I looked around and I could see things that I couldn't see before. And I just had that same effect. It was, it's just, you become blinded and don't know what you can't see. And then So I can't say anything more coherent, but that was fascinating and really, really helpful. So, ladies and gentlemen, any questions, any thoughts?
That was really useful, thank you. I just have a quick question. If you have a team with kind of stubborn stakeholder executives, let's say, do you have particular frames you recommend avoiding or recommend using more? Let's say with the executive team, if the project team is then going to use other frames that are more detail oriented?
I think it probably depends what the reason for the stubborn CEOs or chief executives is. I think what Mariana and Ian Larson tomorrow are going to talk about, and Mariana already talked about it, is, sometimes you've got these big conflicts in terms of, do we do things now or do things, get things out fast or do things properly, this tension. And I think those sorts of tensions need to be tackled at a high level, and they probably a cloud, I find, a cloud is probably my go-to to sort of surface underlying tensions that can be treated. And then if it's a big one and a fundamental one, you just, you know, work backwards and tackle it at the first level. I mean, I usually can think of about 2 or 3 frames you could use for any problem, and and there's not necessarily one right one. But certainly to me, the cloud would be one of the top ones I would use. But I think also the gold tree is actually a really good one, because it focuses, well, what actually are we trying to do here, folks? And I actually sent somebody off to do a gold tree recently, and with their organization, and they spent, the person was quite worried at the start because they spent quite a long time trying to work out what the goal was. But actually I said, well, that's actually very normal and very typical, and actually a good thing to be doing is actually working out, well, what is our goal? And Detmer's got this lovely paper on the gold tree, and it's called What is Our Goal? Oh, what is our goal? And he talks about in a supermarket chain when he was working with top executives and they wanted to rattle something out quickly, and they started thinking about the goal, and they all thought they knew what the goal was. 2-3 hours later, I can't remember exactly what it was, they were still arguing about what the goal was. You know, so I think there are some things that I think we take for granted that at a high level would be really useful to just drop in there and say, well, do we actually know what our goal is? You might be surprised at the reaction. I don't know what do other people think.
I think you did right. It's the clouds to the ones that just over and over help you suddenly see things just with clarity, and they're so quick.
I think the clouds are quick.
And the beautiful bit, there was bounce. I can't remember who it was. Earlier on, someone was talking about being ignorant of the situation and not being an expert, and then they got, maybe it was UC, and then they guide someone through a process using the clouds, and the person that puts together the clouds looks and they feel so clever because suddenly they've seen stuff that they couldn't before. And the nice bit is that they think that the person who's guided them through the cloud process is just as clever or cleverer than they are as well. But I was thinking, Emily, if you're thinking about maybe the difference between more senior people and more people who are closer to the coalface, I think the gold tree is really useful for people who are higher up and got broader responsibilities. The two, I know Carl and Graham and I talk about this often, and it came up in one of the earlier talks, is that when you go to people and you say, look, we've got to get this thing done, what's stopping us? And you flip into the prerequisite tree kind of mode of tackling problems. That's something that a whole lot of people can get really clever on very, very quickly. Yeah. So sorry, I overspoke someone accidentally.
No, I think the other thing about ToC, about the PRT and some of the other tools, the negative branch, is that we don't mind people coming up with negatives and obstacles because we have tools to get over them. And so we're not scared about people dumping the dirty stuff. We'd actually like them to tell us what are the problems that we need to fix, because we've got the tools. So I think that's that. Yeah.
I noticed at the bottom of the goal tree on the one that was about using a resource and engaging multiple stakeholders, I noticed that there were 2 injections. One of them was leadership, and the other was the ideas exchange between stakeholders. And that's exactly the conversation you're having right now. If you have an ideas exchange between stakeholders, and Agile is a classic conversation about trying to create ideas exchange and many other frames as well, but without the leadership component. So without the leadership creating an environment for people to exchange ideas, it doesn't work. So I was interested when I saw those 2 injections. I see those just about all the time at the bottom of gold trees. Those two injections, leadership and ideas exchange.
I don't think you're
And
supposed to have injections at the bottom of a gold tree, but they're necessary conditions that have to be put in place. I think now what we do is we color code them red to say they're not in place and we need to do them. Because that's what fascinates me. Leadership often is about their security. So when you start looking at what are the security drivers and needs of leaders, it impacts what sort of ideas exchange happen between stakeholders. But you need both of those things. So I think it's a really great, it's great to see. I got excited when I saw that at the bottom, because I see that in almost all problem solving. If you don't have those two things inside an organization, then it tends to fall off. But awesome. Well, I was just going to go back to Emily's thing, but she's just jumped off. That in fact, having the top management open to ideas from below is pretty critical as well. Yeah.
Right. It is one of those things that what's stopping us, if you talk about using these tools effectively, and I think it's like when you go back to Peter Thorby, when his example, he was talking about this emotional intelligence and the desire to actually get people chatting and talking together and making them feel safe about getting there, and then bouncing off that idea of when you're having fun as well, Vicky, and it just create an environment where you actually feel clever because you've got together and you've solved problems that you wouldn't have otherwise. So easy to shrink back to our little personal silos. It's so hard to actually get people to work together. But anyway, hey, I think all that talk of bacon and sausages has actually had a really profound effect on me. And I'm thinking that we should wrap that up. But Vicky, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. And just more broadly than that, thank you anyway. Just for all sorts of stuff. Tomorrow we start again, and tomorrow morning we have. Let me just run through really quickly. We've got Ian Larson is going to talk about the quality versus speed conflict. So he's at WiseTech. Really, I just can't help it. I've seen his slides and we've talked through them, and there's a lot of wisdom there. And I just think it's going to be a really good session to get us going. And then after that, we have Umberto Baptista, who's actually coming to us from Brazil, from the past, because the way time zones work, apparently. We've got some dodgy looking fellow called Graham Scott, who's going to go on and on and on about budgeting and accounting and the work that he did with you, Vicky. And I know that's actually surprisingly riveting. And then we've got Alex, and I can't pronounce your last name safely, Alex, but Alex has got some stuff which will be quite surprising and quite interesting about how there's some stuff that was going on behind the Iron Curtain. I'm not going to say any more, but it's kind of like it's like the James Bond movie, but quicker. And then we've got 3 sessions following that. Jared Saxton is going to talk about adding purpose, using ToC and the thinking tools, and a process he's come up with that helps you figure out what your purpose is. And I know Graham's worked through his stuff. It's really, really, it's eye-opening. Then we've got Shane Hasty, who was here, but I think he might have gone to get his dinner. Shane's a coach, but he's not just a coach. He's like a coach's coach. He's my coach. And although we all read about Socratic method and all that kind of stuff of helping people, I don't practice that except by accident. Shane is actually, trained in that proper, type of coaching, and the way he describes it is not listening to the advice, not letting the advice monster come out too often. So he's not a ToC expert, but he's a coaching expert, and I think that'll just be really interesting for us. And then Larissa Day is going to do a sketch note session. So when we were talking, Vicky, the other day, we were talking about the soft systems methodology and how they use rich pictures. We're going to kind of do a sort of the cool modern version of that. And Larissa's really, really good. She's going to do it live. She's also really brave. So that should be good. And then we end with the godfather of, I think, Australasian ToC, James Powell. And he's going to tell us some stories. And we have roped in Graham and Carl to keep him corralled and get the most out of him, because there's a lot of people smiling here and know exactly what I'm referring to. That'll be really fascinating way to end.
Wish us luck.
Good luck.
James taught me clouds.
Yes.
Taught me the MSW, the Management Skills Workshop thing back in about 1996, I think.
Yeah.
So
it's all his fault.
For foundation, he is a fabulous thinker, and he taught me the quick way of doing the cloud resolution and all sorts of stuff. So learned all sorts of mad stuff from James.
Cool.
Great.
So we blame you, some of us. You can blame him.
Well, if anybody needs, if anybody wants to follow up any of those models, I'm happy to do that. Covered quite a bit of material there, unknown stuff. So
that's cool.
Might be unknown to people.
Thank you very much, Vicky. Thank you very much, everyone. And see you again tomorrow. Good stuff.
Thank you.
Thank you.